So we'll get started this evening. I'm Galen Piper. I'm the Director of Public Programs here at Cantigny Park, and I'm so pleased that you've decided to spend your evening with us. This event, Civic Awareness Series, is a collaborative event between the League of Women Voters and Cantigny Park. We're so honored to have the League run their lecture series from Cantigny Park, as Robert McCormick had a long history of encouraging healthy debate on civic education. Our speaker this evening is David Hiller. He's a friend of the McCormick Foundation. He is an experienced news media publisher, attorney, and a philanthropic executive. I'm sorry. He had a 20-year career at the Tribune Company, where he started as vice president and general counsel in 1988. He served in many leadership roles through that time, including president of the Tribune Interactive, publisher of the Chicago Tribune, and publisher of Los Angeles Times. Highly involved on boards in various philanthropic and charitable organizations, Hiller also served as the president and CEO of the McCormick Foundation from 2009 to 2020. His board involvement has included the Field Museum, the Chicago History Museum, and the Illinois Holocaust Museum and Thrive Chicago. And before we hear from David, I do want to offer a few housekeeping notes. So if you're joining us virtually, please go ahead and drop your questions into the Q&A. Those can come in at any time. We will address them at the end of the program. And for those of you who are joining us in person, you have an orange note card in front of you. Feel free to write your question on that note card at any time during the program. And if you give a subtle raise of that card, that can be collected during the program and will again be addressed at the end of the program. So if you'll join me in welcoming David here for his talk.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. Thanks for coming out. It's quite the fall evening out there. And at least it's not raining and it's not 30 degrees, but you can feel there's fall in the air. A small advertisement. I believe there's going to be a big fall festival here over the weekend. So if anybody has time on Friday, Saturday, and Sunday, there's going to be all sorts of festivities, so come back. I'm personally so happy to be back here. As you heard, I spent about a dozen years full-time working with Cantigny and the McCormick Foundation, so I'd be here all the time. Since I moved on to my next chapter 3 years ago, I don't get out here quite as much, so it's wonderful to be out, and particularly to be here for this series, which actually had begun while I was still at the foundation, and as I'll talk a little bit about later, the kernel was, and the foundation is all about civic engagement and community engagement. So I think the partnership with the League is absolutely fabulous. I will say, and some of you may be veterans of some of this, when I was at McCormick, one of the things we did on the sort of building and strengthening democracy work, and we did this arm in arm with the League at least twice. Were any of you veterans of the battles to get redistricting reform in Illinois to stop the gerrymanders? And we did that. We were trying to get the independent commission model, and the League was one of the lead partners in doing that work, but McCormick, we also pitched in, but we tried twice, if you remember. It's right when I was coming into the foundation in 2009, so anticipating the 2020 census and redistricting, we tried then, and we made it all the way through. We got all the signatures and we got tossed out by the Supreme Court, and then licked our wounds for a little while, and it came back hard at it again with the League in 2019, thinking that we could remedy the legal defects in our case, and we went all the way. We raised a lot of money and raised all the signatures, but once again we were tossed out by the Illinois Supreme Court in a partisan line vote, if you look at the parties from which they were elected. So the focus on elections and the focus on democracy is so important, and it's never been more important, and maybe never more in some ways in perilous times than we are currently. And the other thing is, and I'll talk a little bit about a couple of them. This gives me an opportunity to weave in some of the work of two organizations that I've been working with in my new chapter. One is the Campaign Legal Center, that you see their logo on that. That is a nonpartisan, sort of pro-voting civic participation group based in DC, including they do a lot of sort of public interest law to legal work. And then there's another group, the News Literacy Project, that I'll talk a little bit about too, which I think is another really important ingredient, is to how do we help people build the skills to know what's true and believable from a lot of the other stuff that comes out. So we got a ton to talk about, and I hope we will have time at the end. This will be much more interesting if it involves your comments and discussion together and questions, and we'll be sure that we have time for that. Let's see here, do I need to point? Is that now working? Yes. Oh, it's upside down. Well, who'd have thought? Why would that make any difference? So, trust in elections, we already recognized. So I think most people who are here, you all know this was originally not even his house, but his grandfather's house. McCormick's maternal grandfather was Joseph Medill, who bought this, was a farm in 1895, and it was then called Red Oaks Farm. And the colonel eventually inherited it, and after he went into World War I and served in the Battle of Cantigny, the first American battle and the first American victory in World War I, in honor of all the soldiers and people who served, he renamed this Cantigny. And that's what it's been since. I pulled this out. So this is a campaign flyer. He ran successfully. He was just brand newly minted out of law school, and he ran for alderman and won. It was in 1904. He was recruited by a big sort of Republican organizational person. Anybody recognize the last name Bussey? As in there's a Bussey Highway that runs somewhere. Well, Fred Bussey ran a big part of the Republican machine. It's hard for us now to think that there was a time when there was a Republican machine in anywhere in Chicago, but indeed there was. And Bussey recruited McCormick in the view that was sort of very popular at the time, which was to get sort of white stocking, silk stocking candidates to run, and the idea being it would help burnish the image of it was kind of like how Teddy Roosevelt in New York got into politics. But as I say, he was just barely out of law school, but was recruited, and then he worked tirelessly. He worked like 16-hour days out to introduce people. He'd run around and tell everybody, "Hey, call me Mac," as he'd shake hands. For those of us who can only picture later in life, Colonel, very patrician, it's hard for us to think of him running around and asking people to call him Mac, but indeed he did. And then he was only there a year, and then he ran and successfully for another very important job, to be president of the Chicago sanitary district. So he was responsible for all the CalSag and the other canals, and for cleaning a lot of the water. He got into huge fights with some of the powers that be at the time. There was a guy, people remember the name Samuel Insull, who basically the guy who created Commonwealth Edison. And they had a big fight over who was going to own the power production facilities on the river. But anyway, the colonel's basic approach, which continued to be when he got more active in the paper was he was a reformer, a good government type, an engineer in part by background, so he brought a lot of expertise and efficiency into the operation. But he had these 2 elections, and then within 5 years, by 1910, the situation was something they needed him back at the Tribune. And as I'm told, he somewhat reluctantly left politics. He thought he continued to have a fairly big ego, so I think he thought he could be governor or even beyond that. But anyway, he went on instead to build the amazing empire that he did at the Tribune. So we're talking about trust, and this is a graphic that shows that we're going to focus a lot on trust in elections, but what this shows is this issue of falling trust in our institutions has been going on for some time, and I think you're probably all familiar with this. The Colonel would like, I think, that the fact that the military was an exception to those trends, and we could talk and spend whole evenings on what's happened to trust in all of our institutions, but basically, I think the thing that life and politics and society has become a lot more complicated since World War II, and Vietnam did a lot of things in terms of overall trust and generational difference. But anyway, it's a complicated thing, but it's not at all a good state of affairs. And why do we care? Well, in fact, trust matters, and I think we all understand that from our own experience in life. When you're in relationships or in organizations where trust is low, things don't work. You need trust as the kind of the lubricant and the glue that makes things work, that holds us together. And trust in elections, particularly, and we've seen this in some of the recent elections. If people think that the elections are cooked and that the system's rigged, or use the language that you will, people will show up in smaller numbers. And I don't know it's the case, but a lot of people say that, you remember when the 2 Georgia Senate runoff were having right after the special elections, right after the 20 election, that all the talk about nothing working in the elections, people think really dampened some of the turnout. And when you if you can affect turnout, you affect results, and it affects the overall belief that, well, are these people there legitimately, and so do we trust them and support them as our leaders, even if whether we did or whether we didn't vote for them. And then you get to it affects how we talk to each other and how we talk across differences, and different party differences, or religious differences, or racial differences. And we're living through a chapter where a lot of that has become harder and harder. And then you specifically get, if you erode trust far enough, people start to object to the handing over power to the new people. And whatever your view or politics of January 6th and what came of that, certainly the eroded trust and the feeling that something was stolen contributed to what happened there that day. So this was, I'm going to share some of the research from the Campaign Legal Center, but then I did a little on my own. So some of this in the first couple of things comes from the MIT election lab out at Massachusetts Institute of Technology, and they do this every 2 years after every either presidential or midterm election, and they ask a lot of questions, but including how much confidence do you have in that your vote counted and that your votes were counted right in your state, and they have also in nationwide. And so this is from 2012, 2016. It was fairly flat, and then you see it dropped some after. This is polls, surveys that were taken after the 2020, after the election in each case. But here I thought was really very striking difference. The averages don't tell you the whole picture. That what this does down is breaks out separately people who identify as Republicans and people who identify as Democrats. And what you see is after 2012, which was Obama's second election, the fairly high confidence by the Democrats and Republicans saying, well, not so much. And then 2020 happens and Trump beats Clinton, and then all of a sudden the Republicans' stated confidence in the election integrity soars up to the, close to getting toward 80 or 80+%, and Democrats declines significantly. And then, lo and behold, in 20, this past election, where Trump loses to Biden, the Democratic confidence goes well up again over 90, and the Republican stated confidence in the election is way down in the basement. And we can talk about and share thoughts about what contributes to this. But I want to share that one thing that contributes to this, and you heard in this, I'm a recovering news guy. I spent 20 years in the newspaper business at the Chicago Tribune and a little bit of time at the LA Times. And I think we've probably all seen this, and I think it's a very broad phenomenon that as mainstream media, if you will, has fragmented into a lot of different channels, one of the things that the media companies have done is they've identified their niche or their base or their audience in political orientation terms, whether it's, pick your favorite one up there. But I think it is a real phenomenon, and that media executives are able to identify if they can mobilize their base, whichever way it is, that becomes their audience base, and that's what they sell to advertisers. And so polarization on the media side has become a business model, and it may be good for business, but I think very debatable what it's done to the country. So election trust, we've seen, is down. It's a combination of factors that, I think part of it is the disinformation that's put out about it, and some non-intentional maybe, but some definitely is intentional because I think, truth be told, that that polarization model and playing to the base is not just the media business model, it's a political business model. And so not everyone shares the same incentives on how we communicate information and how accurate it is. Part of it, too, is that we don't do and we'll get some into this, this is where some of the Campaign Legal Center research is from, is that a lot of people don't have a very good knowledge of, and this is where the league's work is so important. People don't really know how the elections work and what checks and balances there are in it, and who, where the votes go after they're counted. So part of it is people, because they don't know, they can imagine the worst, or believe that, all right, well, maybe people did carry away the boxes of the printed ballots and stuffed them somewhere. But and this is where I want to mention, because it's a group that I've joined on the board, the Campaign Legal Center. They're based in Washington, D.C. They do a lot of legal work to protect voting rights and election integrity. And a big part of what they're wanting to do is help, and it'd be interesting to partner with the league, basically to work on this issue of how well do people understand our elections, and what safeguards there are, and why should we trust them or not trust them, or how could they be made better. So again, like the diminished trust overall, disinformation can be very hostile to a democratic environment, and whether it's through social media or mainstream media or wherever it can come from, if we talked earlier, if people don't believe in the elections that their vote is going to be fairly counted, they may not vote. A whole other category is not going to election integrity, but information about candidates that gets spread by whomever can be misleading, if not corrected, to voters. And so the whole issue of how together we can spread more real information rather than disinformation is really, really important. So in the Campaign Legal Center, they did their own, this is now some of the research they did, some of their own polling, and their poll results reflected the broad pattern after 2020 that we saw on the earlier slide, that the level of confidence, particularly among conservative-leaning voters, really fell, but there are also gaps in trust among some of the liberal-leaning ones, and they're very different. Basically, on the conservative-leaning voters suspected that there were all sorts of categories in the election process where fraud was likely to occur and had occurred, and so they believed, they did not believe in the reliability of the election results. Some of the liberal-leaning skeptics were more on the side of, they thought some of the rules that were adopted in some states weren't fair, that they, like ID requirements or some things, could suppress turnout if there wasn't enough early voting opportunity, that it would handicap people who had trouble getting to the polls on election day. So some of their expressed concerns were more systemic than about voter fraud per se. And what you saw was that the next slide is hard to read, but that among the conservative-leaning voters, almost every stage of the voter process, they were concerned that there was room for fraud, and that fraud was likely. And this included, and we could see in all the publicized disputes the issue about mail-in votes. Are they reliable? Or can they be harvested or made fraudulently? And then what this research showed too was that particularly after all the steps in the process after the election occurred were kind of invisible to people, and that was where a lot of the concern were, that how do we know that the votes are being counted well? What happens to the printed ballots? Who are the poll watchers and the election supervisors? And so really through the whole process from the day the ballots are sent in afterwards, there was a lot of distrust. And, so that the fact over on the left, and this is even now, more than 2 years after the 2020 election, a very significant part of the voter base, including a very significant part of the Republican voter base, believed that the election wasn't reliable, that it may have been stolen. And despite what you'd see in the reports of a lot of efforts to verify allegations that there was voter fraud. And, the Justice Department looked at a ton of those back in the weeks right after the election. And, and there were dozens of lawsuits brought and repeated audits. But despite that, there's this level of at least about a third of the Republican-leaning voters who continue to say it wasn't legitimate. So we talked about, I think I talked, about the lack of information. I think comes through as one of the things that if people understand the process and the checks and balances that are in place. And another thing that the research said, it's not just that these elements of the information that people will respond to, but it's really important who the speakers are, who the messengers are for saying these things, and whether it's going to be political leaders or the responsible election officials. But you need spokespeople leading this discussion who are themselves trustworthy. And here's another, I think, great opportunity for the league that you've been in this, had this mission of getting accurate information and to constructively get people engaged in electoral process for decades, would be a natural lead in getting the word out on these things to help build the level of trust. And the research did show, because they tested out some of these things, that people will be responsive to when they get accurate information from people they believe. And so the good news is this, that I think the trust deficit that we've seen emerge isn't an inescapable negative thing for the rest of our lives, but it's definitely going to take work. And here again, voter education is going to be a core part of it. One thing that I had not thought about that comes up in this that I thought was very interesting is that the knowledge about the people, the friends and neighbors who are at the polls and are actually supervising the voting experience can have a lot to do with the level of trust. In fact, there was a separate thing that was reported. One of the significant factors in determining how much trust somebody said they had in the election result is how their own voting experience went. So, including a major factor was how long did you have to wait in line? Because if things are delayed and people doesn't look like it's running efficiently, people say, well, there's all sorts of opportunity for bad things to happen. So that the election workers personalizing that. There was one, I didn't put all this information, but there was other, I thought, really interesting information that people had more confidence about elections in their own counties, and then less so about their own statewide. And then where it really started to fall off was, how do you think the election integrity was nationwide? And so it's a little bit like, because you'll see the same thing. Remember the earlier slide about trust in Congress and those things. So local, most people like their local congressman, and they have reasonably high confidence in them. But then you ask them, well, what about for the whole Congress? And then it drops to the floor, and so it goes from like 70% confidence in their local person to like 0 or 10% for the Congress as a whole. And the same is true with this as you get further away, and it's somebody else's state. And we're sitting in Illinois, and they say, well, why the heck does it take them 3 days to figure things out in Arizona? I mean, something must be really goofed up there, and they've got certain procedures that they follow to match up signatures and that kind of thing. But as people get further and further away, they have less and less trust. Likewise, in a given state, in Illinois, if you're a Republican-leaning person, but you're in a state that's controlled by the other party, you show up with less confidence about the election result, and vice versa in states where there are red governors and legislators. So it's about both it's the relationships, it's the message, it's the information from people hearing it from people that people trust. We talked about the election workers. That was a recurrent theme that I thought was very interesting and could be built on. One of the things, to get more people involved in the election day activity, and so people can talk to their friends and neighbors about the process, and they say, well, I was there, and things seem to be smooth, and then it said, some of the supplemental information you could give people, like one thing that I think really comes through is that there are these additional after-election tests or checks or audits that the machines are reviewed. As we'll see later, the huge difference in trust if you're in a place that keeps that does paper voting, where I think more and more there are fewer and fewer all electronic voting, because people, if you're actually marking it, rather than using a touch screen, and the other thing that those systems do, which help build confidence, is you continue to have a paper trail. You put your own ballot into the machine, and that's kept and counted, and it's available for audit after the fact. Makes a huge amount of difference, rather than the votes just going into the digital ether, and who knows how they get counted or how they get held on to. Yeah. Poll watchers, people, that there are effective poll watchers in places. One of the things, it's not poll watchers directly, but one of the programs we have here in Illinois that I always loved is training high school students to go in and be election judges. And I think we do that in a lot of counties around the state. And it's a great thing. It builds the habit of engagement with the students. They end up being pretty good at the technology, to the extent there's technology involved in the workplace. So they're good election judges, and I think it's great for voters to see the next generation be there and be active and be part of the whole process. Some of these, though, are not some of the early stages of, particularly the mail-in absentee ballots, is one of those very, very contested parts, and they become very controversial. But it's been very interesting. Just in the last 2 weeks, I read that the woman who's the person who's the chairman of the Republican National Committee has come out and said, hey, party, we need to get on board with early voting and absentee voting, and there's no way that we can be competitive the way we want to do if we don't take advantage of those channels as well as the others. So both their reliability and because they expand access for people who would otherwise may have trouble getting to vote, I think is opening some eyes about how much they should be supported. Here's one of my other favorite subjects. This wasn't included in the CLC work, but it's near and dear to the League's heart and my heart. At McCormick, we helped lead a campaign. Illinois, going back several years, Illinois was one of only a handful of states that didn't require civics in either high school or middle school. And I don't know about you, my feeling had been that it was that's a really important ingredient of a broad-based education. That, you know, you go back to the start of the country, a major role of our public schools was to get the next generation of people, of citizens, ready to be citizens. And so you've got all this important, it's both, you know, content about, you know, branches of government and how they work, but also to expose young people to developing these habits of civic engagement, so that they will vote, and they'll, you know, may consider running for office, and engaging in the community in all the myriad ways that you can do it. And one of the most important things in the civics curriculum is building in opportunities for young people to talk about difficult subjects with other people of differing views. And this may be the one area of greatest need in our society generally, is that we're losing the ability and the habit of connecting with people who we may disagree with, a different party or what have you. And you need to be able to do that if there's going to be any hope at all that you're going to be able to make connections and get things done. And so one of the big ingredients of the civic education curriculum is to build in opportunities under in a classroom setting to begin to practice and develop these habits of civil conversation with other people. But you can imagine nothing's easy, so you'd start to introduce these controversial subjects into the schools, and then that itself becomes a subject of controversy. And they say, well, how can you talk about that, or how can you talk about that? And a teacher's indoctrinating, you know, it's just, everything's hard. But the worst would be that we sort of wash our hands of it and say we're not going to try to get good quality civics back in. And happily, through work and the league helped with this, so we got civics back into the high schools, and then just a couple years ago we had redid the effort to bring it into the middle schools too, because, you know, junior, senior high school is too late to start building some of this knowledge and habits. So, and I'm, you know, in terms of long-term support for our effective democracy, I'm a huge believer in quality civic education. And another group I work with, and this, because of we got into this through the journalism program that we were doing at McCormick, and we thought about it a little bit in terms of, well, in news, you know, you talk about the marketplace of ideas. You got the supply side of the producers, the newspapers and TV and social media and all those things. Then you got the demand side, all the readers and consumers and listeners. And there's a lot of problems on both sides of the equation, because the business model for news has gotten so difficult with the internet. But the other thing we a lot of people saw, and was that the demand side needed a little help, because in this explosion of information in the internet age, you know, it was like drinking out of the proverbial fire hose, and people feel overwhelmed, and young people particularly, and raising that issue. How do I know? Where should I get my information? And how do I know what's real, what's true? So there's a group, the News Literacy Project, that now is over 10 years old, and that was their mission, to develop, focused primarily on middle and high school initially, but developing curriculum to help students, give them the tools to figure out what to believe. And it begins by asking questions like this. When you see some information, start to ask yourself questions about, you know, who's this from, and what are they trying to do, and what kind of publication is it, or we go through some of the tenets of what I think still today are the heralds of real equality journalism, and that's good sourcing, verification, fact checking, disclosure about where the information is coming from, and so the coursework, and it's also available had over the years done a lot of work with student groups in the communities, because we found when we got out and would talk about it, adults are saying, hey, guess what? I got the same issue with all of this, particularly, social media has been a new major sort of morass, if you will, of content that you really do need practice at how to navigate through it. So, my feeling on all of this, and here again, is there's such great alignment with the league, is this is not somebody else's problem. This is our issue to wrestle with. And we can either all be part of the problem, or we can all try to be part of the solution in terms of how we interact with our fellow citizens, how we interact with people who have different views than we do, how we think about our own media menu and appetite, and how good are we about trying to not forward on and circulate information that we should maybe realize may not be reliable. Talking with friends and neighbors and particularly our family about these things. I think so much, probably when a lot of us were growing up, you'd do some of this at the dinner table, and you'd have conversations at the table about all sorts of things, but including about what's going on in the community and what we're going to do, how we're going to be involved, and our parents would be models of engagement on things and being in the league or being in the PTA or what have you. And I think we need to restore the dinner table or the breakfast table or wherever people eat these days as one of the family points of engagement and convening. Because again, it's not just somebody else's problem. It's not just something somebody else is doing. And we all need to be part of the solution. So I still try to be. And that's why I thank you for letting me come out and talk about this subject tonight. And so I think now we have opportunity we've got some maybe questions. Thank you, virtual audience, people at home. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll take some questions.
All right. We have a question from one of our online audience members, and it asks if you could go into a little bit more the distinction between misinformation and disinformation.
Yes, that's a great question. Oh yes, yeah. So the question is, what is the difference of misinformation with an M and disinformation with a D? And I think the biggest distinction usually made is that disinformation usually is intentional, or said or thought to be intentional, which makes it that somebody is spreading disinformation for the purpose of influencing people with false information. Misinformation can come from a lot of places, that people are just mistaken, or the polling place moved and somebody didn't know, but disinformation is I would describe it as the intentional use of false or misleading information in order to influence people. And, we didn't, a whole other category of some of this, we didn't talk about foreign influences, and which have been well documented, but the efforts of Russians, particularly their internet troll factories that sit around and generate disinformation to spread around and you know, including I mean, some of that stuff that was like the false information about whether the voting systems have been hacked into. So people will put that out. The thing about disinformation is you don't have to prove it or disprove it for it to have a corrosive effect on trust. The word gets out, oh, these voting machines, somebody hacked in and they took all the votes away, or you know, changed the count and that kind of thing. And it's hard to beat down a rumor because it'll still insinuate itself out there. But anyway, that's the major difference I think of.
Okay, thank you. You had a question about paper ballots, and
I just wonder why that's a solution when there's so much paper. You know what I'm saying? Why are you saying it's a solution to have paper ballots?
Well, two things. At least one is the paper ballots with the little circles filled in and the thing are available physical evidence that can be gone back to after an election and doing a recount. So you can get back to the original source thing that David actually filled in those little bubbles with his magic marker, and they can be recounted. Whereas I think a lot of it, if you go back to when I was little, I don't remember those refrigerator-sized voting machines that had like big switches on, where that's where you pulled the handle if you wanted to, yeah. And those were all mechanical, I think. And then for a while, some counties were going to the touchscreen digital thing and without a paper trail. So I think there's an underlying ability to audit of the paper ones. And then partly for that reason, and just because of the feel of the tangible ballot that people have filled out, it shows in the research that people do believe that makes a difference.
thank you. Question here, you had a nice slide up there about the media outlets and, you know, and their orientation. So we can see that there are a lot of them that lean one way or the other. But can you speak about some that you feel are more fact-based in their approach?
Yeah, that's very subjective. So one of the things that, but I'll tell you what I think. And the other thing that we'll do in the news literacy curriculum, and one of the habits is to because you're trying to build everyone's literacy. So there's advantage to getting your news from a variety of sources. So for me, every morning that I can, I read my dear Chicago Tribune, which I still get in print, and I also read online the Wall Street Journal, and I read the New York Times, and I'll see a bunch of different magazines and email letters. But I'm reading the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal with a view that they're going to have somewhat different takes, or very different takes on things, particularly on their editorial pages. And then you also get differences of evidence, even in the reported sections. They'll emphasize different things and quote different. You know, journalism isn't a total science, but within recognizing that the New York Times is a little more liberal and the Wall Street Journal a little more conservative, I find reading them both and seeing how they contrast or don't. But I consider them both to be in the mainstream of traditional journalism that actually tries to do most of those things that journalists should do. And I think the same I think our two papers in Chicago, and we're blessed still to have both the Sun-Times and the Tribune. I always said, even when I was running the Tribune, I'm glad we've got two papers. I think it makes both papers better and keeps everybody on their toes. But I do think reading a variety of things and seeing how news is presented. So I'll spend in the evening, if I'm sitting around, I'll maybe not quite half and half, but I'll spend time listening to CNN, and then I'll switch over to Fox News and see what they're saying, each differently. Yeah, so I'm kind of a print journalist guy, and I think most traditional in Chicago, Sun-Times and Tribune both try to do a quality job of reporting. I think that's true of both those national newspapers, but again, they've got slightly different philosophical takes on things.
Thanks. We have another question from our online audience, and this one has to do with the Electoral College. The question is, do you think that that some of the mistrust that's out there relative to elections is due to the fact that the Electoral College and popular vote have not aligned a couple of times here in the last couple of decades?
Yes, for sure, and that's a huge issue. Now, the Electoral College was the gift of our founding fathers, and they wrote it into the Constitution, and it was with the intention of balancing the power somewhat, particularly it reflects the balance of power in the Senate as well as in the presidential election, but they were trying to offset the smaller states were afraid of getting overrun and controlled by the New Yorks and Pennsylvanias and Virginia at the time, which was one of the biggest states. So everybody had 2 senators, even if you only had 2 people or 10, 20 people or however many and then that was carried forward into the Electoral College, which, as we know, is every state gets electoral votes equal to the total of its senators and representatives. So that was the original bargain made in the Constitutional Convention, and it does result and has in 2 or 3 of the last 4 or 5 elections where you can lose the popular vote but win in the Electoral College, and I think that is a lot of people raise that just doesn't seem right. Now it's baked into the sort of our original compact as a country about how those things worked. It would be, I think, very hard to change through a constitutional amendment. The thing on the Electoral College that I think should be done differently, which isn't required by the Constitution, is our winner-take-all system, which is a decision the states make. And as you may know, there are 2 states, I forget, Nebraska and somebody else, or New Hampshire or something. There are a couple states that I should know that do allocate their electoral votes proportionately, and typically they'll do that by congressional district. They'll decide who won each, and they'll divvy up their votes that way. And if all the states did that, it would do a couple of things. One is it would make every state in the union part of the election, and people would care. We'd actually get presidential candidates coming to Illinois to do more than raise money. They'll do that, but they'd come to campaign because they care that there are, whatever the split would be, but there'd be electoral votes that they could get. And the most beneficial aspect of that would be that it would get rid of the, I think, very unhealthy focus on the so-called swing states. There are only 5 or 6 states that anybody cares about, the same ones. And it's that kind of focus so raises the stakes on every single vote or hanging Chad or in Florida or whatever you have, so that everything becomes, the whole elections can turn on a very small number of votes. Whereas if it was done where, there were votes you could get in California proportionally, I think it would be healthier. And there have been studies on it. It wouldn't systematically necessarily. It depends on, what's happening in the congressional elections, which wouldn't be all bad either, that we're more tied. But it's shown it wouldn't not systematically help one party or hurt one party, and I just think would be very healthy.
All right, we have an up-to-date question, up to the minute. How do you think AI may potentially affect upcoming elections?
Oh boy, that's a huge one, and I'm hoping that there are lots of people above my pay grade and certainly above my computer experience that are focused on that. I think it could be, and probably already is, and we don't maybe even see some of it. I think a huge, I'll say a huge risk, and then there are also things that we could do that AI that could probably defend the integrity of elections and detect fraud. But one of the issues that you see is the ability of AI to generate unlimited quantities of content at your direction. And so I think there's a lot of concern, and I'm not aware that we think there have been huge volumes of this unleashed yet, but we were talking about disinformation earlier, but the possibility that you could generate these AI engines to spew out a lot of false and misleading information and not be able to tell, including very, very, very realistic looking videos of politicians saying or doing things that only AI did or said, and that they weren't real. So these so-called deep fakes that you can do. I think at another level, nobody knows the extent to which AI engines could develop the capacity to hack into digital systems, including to the extent that the voting systems are, and they are digital. That's why another thing, why having something like the print audit track of elections, and the fact that everything's not wired together into one giant national election system. That would make me stay up late at night. I think the fact that we've got highly decentralized, most of this is run at the county level or below in some thing, or county and city, so that to have a highly decentralized system with local officials who are close to the people and accountable to the local people running things and running separate systems in different ways and learning from each other, that gives me a lot of confidence. So yeah, I think we're just beginning to see, and I hope again some of our really good computer minds are thinking about how we address all those issues.
We have another question from our online audience. As a print media guy, as you've just self-described, they would like to know what you think of Elon Musk's comment that newspaper news is day-old news. Well,
Elon's a smart guy on a lot of things. I think the newspapers have been working very, very hard to get themselves beyond the once-a-day cycle, and that's been going on as long as there's been an internet. And so it's now, if almost every print publication I'm familiar with, they've got they're on social media, their web is being updated all of the time, and so I think they're trying to compete in the 24 7 marketplace. One of the challenges that we've gotten, somebody once quipped, sort of on an internet side, that speed is the new accuracy, which is a dangerous thing to believe. But that's partly the challenge that newspapers and other, I call quality news media challenge they have is one of the things that the 24-hour news cycle did was allowed them to have a process of fairly elaborate editing, fact-checking, fact-rechecking things, and so the felt need to be instantly breaking news all the time puts a lot of stress on quality controls. And so I think what the newspapers, at least the ones I know of, are trying to do are balancing that so they can respond to Elon, but be more reliable than a lot of what he turns out.
Yeah. All right, I think we have time for one more question, and you wanted to ask it yourself? All right, well, here you go.
I want to do a little bit of a shout out for the League of Women Voters, and this is in reference to some of what you put up there. We had new voting equipment come out through the DuPage County, and through the efforts of the League of Women Voters of Wheaton, coordinated an effort to provide tutorials, opportunities through leagues hosted in Glen Ellen. We hosted it at the library. People came in and they tested the equipment. They could see it, explain it.
How does it look? How's the new equipment?
It was great.
Good.
It was great. And I think it did exactly what you were suggesting, which was it kind of mitigated some of the, how is this all working? So I thought that the league did a really, really fine job on that. Yeah.
I think the most important point that people need to understand is that it's not connected to the internet. So
Right.
the ability to hack into it is not.
Right, exactly. It's separate from that. Like you said, it's not one big, system, right? The other comment I would make, and this is one in thinking about when there's concern about trust, is I was very concerned last election. I was co-voter services with Dave Evans and the Glen Ellen League about a training that was set up outside of the DuPage County training by a local former elected official here in Wheaton to train to work as an election judge. We have one training, and it's through the county, and we all go through it. I'm an election judge. Several people here are election judges, right? So that was a deep concern for me, that was going on separate from the training, which again would foster this distrust, and it was wrong, in my opinion.
And did they go through with that?
Yeah. It was held. So my question is kind of twofold. Do you feel like the press either unwittingly or intentionally reinforce some of the election security concerns by not being good stewards of challenging this concept of alternative facts? And as a second part of it, as a journalist, what is the responsibility of the press today, print, television, cable, etc., to hold news accountable to facts?
Oh, I think it's core to the mission, and I also think that even the best news organizations can always do better and do more than they do. One of the things that in the news literacy work that we did, the News Literacy Project people have attempted to engage local news people of both print and television news in being involved in their efforts with the schools and going out and talking to students about how they collect the news, how they report the news, how they fact check, and to basically be a part of the solution in terms of how people think about what news is believable and what other information is believable. And I think there's a huge role for news media in doing that. One of the problems that or challenges that they have in doing that is that business is under such economic pressure that compared to some of the old days when they had many, we've lost half the professional journalists in the country in the last 10, 15 years. And so everybody's doing like 4 or 5 jobs during the day, and so spreading them even thinner to, participate in news literacy or go out and talk. But the journalists I know all are, want to be part of this, and particularly if it can help bring the next generation along. And hopefully journalists will continue to see that as part of their mission.
Well, we've exhausted both our questions and our time, so that worked out really, really well. So can we thank our presenter once again?
Thank you. And thank all of you for being here, for sponsoring this, and particularly thanking the League for all that you do. It's one of my absolute favorite organizations civically, so keep up that great work. And if there's ever anything I can do to help, let me know. So,
we'll talk. No.
Yeah. Great, thanks. All right, everybody have, or do you have more? Good,
I'm just going to close.
Sorry.
That's okay.
Yep.
Thank you, David, for spending the evening with us and making us more informed about this important topic. And the League will continue to empower voters and defend democracy through civic education and voter education. And as always, thank you to our audience for joining us, both virtually and in person. Thank you. And a big thank you to Cantigny for hosting. Thank you, our program. And thank you to our sister leagues. And we're putting the final details on next month's program, so please be sure to check our website and social media for November's program announcement. Good night, and thank you so much for joining us.
Good job.